And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominick, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, do bears really prefer above-ground swimming pools? And why is Ricky Schroeder such an asshole? And now, the podcast host with the baldest head, the clumpiest beard, and sheddiest of sheddios, Pete Dominick.
Yeah, hello, hi. Thank you, announcer Pete Coe. Well done, sir. He's actually a voiceover artist. If you'd like to hire him, reach out, man. Love that. Well done. Thank you, sir. If you want to make an intro or any kind of contribution to the show, just email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. We'll have a jingle coming up from Pete Coe as well. Joining me today from the Atlantic magazine, the great McKay Coppins, to talk about his profile of Brett Kavanaugh, which is fascinating and great as always. His analysis of the future of the Republican Party, which he has covered for many years. And I also talk with Aaron David Miller, who is a scholar and a diplomat and an analyst on foreign policy, politics, especially as it pertains to the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Gaza, Israel. The violence continues. The worst day we've seen of violence in this latest horrific violent uprising. Aaron David Miller and I have a great conversation. McKay Coppins, Aaron David Miller, and you. Hello, you. Hi there. How are you? Thank you very much for listening to the podcast. My family greatly appreciates your subscription, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes or patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Couple quick shout-outs to regular listeners. Holly Johnson sent me a great picture of vitamin N. These are snapshots that you take anytime you're out in nature, hopefully with no man-made structures. Holly sent a picture of the treetops with the sun poking through and wrote, "My view from my platform to be in the trees, which I love to climb. Yes, still, at this age, 2 weeks shy of 65. Holly is almost 65 and still likes to climb trees. We salute you, Holly Johnson, here at the top of the podcast." An email from Rick, who said, "Pete, good afternoon. Thanks for all you're doing. The next time you have a Republican on your show, will you ask for a definition of too far left? What policies are Democrats proposing that are too radical?" I assume this is what they mean. "And what policies are Republicans proposing to make our lives better? As near as I can tell, Democrats actually want to help people, and Republicans want power and profit. Thank you again." That is from Rick. And this email was sent from Rick's iPhone XR, because Rick did not take that off. It's the automatic signature, I think, isn't it? Yeah, great question, Rick. Thank you for listening. And who is the next Republican I should have on the program? Who would you like to have for me to talk to? Always want to hear from you and get your suggestions. And Julie Jarrett leaves a comment on the Patreon post from Friday's show saying, "I love the show. I practically yelled at my radio that Dr. Carroll has to have a debate with that ass Tucker Carlson. I love Dr. Aaron Carroll's passion. He always tells it like it is." Thank you, Julie, for the comment. Thank you for the subscription, and thank you for all the feedback. Keep those vitamin N pictures coming. Some days I get several, some days I get none, and I'm always scrambling to try to pick the one to send out to the daily subscriber email, which you get every morning, a picture that a listener took from nature. Would love to get yours. Email them to me at standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, time to do the news every day here on the podcast. Well, Monday through Thursday. I haven't been doing the news on the Friday episode, but I do a news segment, and I call it The Last 24 because it covers the last 24 hours. Let's do it.
Last week, the CDC announced that if you're fully vaccinated, you no longer have to wear a mask. It reported that the science now shows that your vaccination protects you as well as being masked, or better than being masked. So you can protect yourself from serious illness from COVID by getting vaccinated or wearing a mask until you're fully vaccinated. Either way, you're protected. As I said last week, some people may want to continue to wear masks, even if they are fully vaccinated. That's a decision they can make. Some businesses may want to continue to require wearing masks. Let's all be kind and respectful to one another as we come out of this pandemic and respect those who want to continue to wear a mask, even if they've been vaccinated. Above all, let's work together, though, to meet the target I've set of 70% of adults, all adults, with at least one shot by July the 4th.
And now here's the president's spokeswoman, Jen Psaki, yesterday being asked a question by reporter Yamiche Sindor about masks and the confusion. Take it away, ladies.
I've talked to some people who are very worried about the idea that we're operating on an honor system in a lot of ways, that we're in places like Walmart and Target, there's already starting to be rule changes based on the CDC guidance. What do you say to people who think it's worrisome to be operating on an honor system, that it could put kids or even immune-compromised Americans at risk?
Well, I would say that what this guidance provides is information to the public about what they can do to be safe. Wear a mask. If you're not vaccinated, that applies to kids. I have 2 kids. That isn't always easy, but that is the health and medical guidance. If you are vaccinated, you no longer need to wear a mask in these settings. So the guidance is actually pretty clear, but it gives people the information and the power to be able to protect themselves. If you get vaccinated, you go through your 2 doses, you're 2 weeks past your doses, you no longer need to wear a mask. If you are not, you should still wear a mask to protect others, but also to protect yourself. And it also makes clear that kids should still wear masks. So I would say that we know people are digesting this. We've all been wearing masks. Many of us have been wearing masks, I should say, for 14 months now, and different companies, different organizations, different communities are going to implement based on a range of factors, including vaccination levels, cases, transmission rates. And we all should respect that. But it was the responsible step to put out the data from the scientists when it was available. And that's exactly what we did.
All right, Jen Psaki in the briefing yesterday. And now I want to head over to CNN, where Wolf Blitzer had evangelical Franklin Graham on his program. And I guess he's still a pretty influential leader in the evangelical movement in the United States of America. He's a huge Trump supporter. But he was on CNN because CNN was trying to help him get his voice out there to tell his people that they got to get vaccinated, because almost half of them haven't and said they aren't. I want to listen to this along with you. Here's Wolf Blitzer, Franklin Graham, a little bit of it from yesterday on CNN.
Reverend Graham, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for all you're doing. I'm sure you saw that Pew Research Center survey that found that 45% of white evangelical Christians said they definitely or probably will not get vaccinated against COVID-19. So what's your message to fellow evangelicals who are still very hesitant to get this potentially life-saving vaccine?
And watch how quickly he works Jesus right in. Let's take it.
Well, first of all, Wolf, I think a lot of this is changing, these attitudes. When Jesus started his ministry, he went about preaching, and he used his power as a Son of God to bring healing to people's bodies. And he didn't do it so they'd have a better life. He did it so they'd put their faith and trust in him as the Son of God. And as a Christian, I think it's important that we model our ministry after that of Jesus Christ. We want to try to bring healing to people's bodies.
Would Jesus prefer, do you think, the Pfizer or the Moderna, or would he want to go with the one-shot Johnson & Johnson?
And we can do that through modern medicine. My grandfather was a surgeon to China. He went there in 1916, and he brought modern medicine at that time to China and used his skills as a surgeon to save life. And he did it in Jesus' name.
Oh, I was wondering whose name he did it in. I guess he went to China in Jesus' name. Well, that's cool. Good thing.
And I think we want to do the same. And the evangelicals, there are many who are hesitant. And I don't think, Wolf, it's just evangelicals. Like 40% of the United States Marine Corps is not going to get vaccinated.
Yeah, I wonder what percentage of the United States Marine Corps is also evangelical.
You have in Germany, people, I think it's close to 50% of the doctors and nurses in that country alone have said they're not going to take the vaccine. I think a lot of people are afraid.
Well, slow your roll there, Frank, on the German statistic. Got to look that one up.
Of just something that's new. And I thank God for vaccine. I thank God for the polio vaccine. I was 6 years old, I think, when I came to our school.
Here comes a folksy story about a sugar cube.
And I remember they put it on a sugar cube. And we all went down to the lunchroom, and they put a little drop of, I believe it was like a blue virus or whatever it was.
They dropped the blue virus or whatever it was. This is great.
And we took it to our mouth, and we ate it.
We took it to our mouth?
Well, this is kind of fun. It's like candy. But I remember that vaccine, and now it's been almost eradicated around the world. And so vaccines are important. I would encourage people to pray about it, consider it. I would never tell somebody they had to have it or try to mandate it. But I think we certainly should encourage people to consider the vaccine. And if you don't...
The only thing I want to mandate is women's bodies. I don't want to mandate anybody having to get vaccinated so that they don't kill my family. That I don't care about. Ugh.
Don't take it. There's some real risks for some groups.
And I know you've been fully vaccinated, and you want everyone to be fully vaccinated.
Yeah, Wolf had a cast a little shade. I know you've been vaccinated, by the way. You didn't say that, but I'll say it for you. Okay, that's enough from Franklin Graham. And speaking of evangelical movement, of course, huge news yesterday that the Supreme Court's going to hear a challenge to a Mississippi law that prohibits nearly all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Been talking about and anticipating the Supreme Court taking one of these cases for a long time. Will this be the case? How much of an effect would it have on the midterm elections in terms of turning folks out, progressive, people who think women should be in control of their bodies, progressive? How much of an effect would, if the Supreme Court strikes down Roe v. Wade and sends it back to the states, meaning that we would have a mishmash of blue and red states that allowed women to control their bodies, and then you'd have Gilead? That's the most important question to me. Of course, I've talked about this with Eric Siegel several times over the years, the actual public health effect, the political outcome. I thought this was good. I happened to catch a little bit of MSNBC Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace, and former Senator and prosecutor Claire McCaskill had this to say.
And just the decision to take up this case really strikes fear in the hearts of everyone who cares about this issue, which, if you look at polls, is about 65% of Americans that support reproductive freedoms.
Yeah, this may end up being the situation that is often described as the dog catching the bus. And what happens in America in terms of the political climate, if in fact this court overturns decades of precedent and fails to protect women's reproductive freedoms via this Mississippi case. And, I got to tell you, Nicole, I don't think younger voters remember what it was like before Roe v. Wade. I don't think they realize that these folks are not going to be happy until a rape victim is put in prison for taking the morning after pill. That's the road they're going down. That's the road they've been trying to go down for a long time, even though they are really pushing provisions that are widely rejected by the vast majority of Americans.
All right, well, I will be talking with public health experts, feminists, historians, and policy experts, as well as others, anybody you can think of about this issue as we go forward. So let me know who you'd like me to speak to right here on the podcast. Also, the Supreme Court, while they said they were going to take this case from Mississippi on abortion, potentially outlawing it or kicking it back to the states, Supreme Court also declined to hear a case centered on N-word in the workplace. Yeah, so they didn't want to hear that one, apparently. So we'll hear the one about the controlling women's bodies and decide what happens to them, but we don't want to talk about the N-word, because that's going to really trip us up. We know one of us is going to accidentally say it. My guess is it's Alito. All right, and the other big story from the last 24 was, again, the violence in the Middle East and Israel and Gaza. Here are some of the headlines. Israeli warplanes launched a fresh round of massive airstrikes in Gaza on Monday as the most serious conflict in years entered its second week, and international calls for a ceasefire mounted. President Biden was on the phone with Benjamin Netanyahu, where apparently he expressed his support for a ceasefire. Senator John Ossoff, who is Jewish, led dozens of Senate Democrats in a statement urging Israel and Gaza to have a ceasefire. President Biden also approved $735 million weapons sale to Israel. And Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said he asked Israel for information to corroborate its claim that Hamas was operating in a building shared by the Associated Press, but that he was yet to see it. Made the comment in a speech in Copenhagen after Israel leveled the building on Saturday, but said he had, quote, not seen any information provided, according to the Associated Press. And on Face the Nation on CBS, Benjamin Netanyahu said he had given that information to America's intelligence services. So I'm pretty confused. I'll talk more about it with Aaron David Miller coming up, but I did want to play this clip that aired on CNN International of a fierce and eloquent young writer and commentator who is Palestinian, who lives in the West Bank. Her name is Miriam Barghouti, and you don't often hear this type of rhetoric on CNN, and I'm so torn by this and hesitant to play things like this because I get so worried that sometimes it gets interpreted, and the hatred for Israel gets interpreted as anti-Semitic, and that always bothers me so much because I have so many. Most of my closest friends are Jewish. I have several Palestinian friends as well, Dino Badala and Mayzoun Zayed, who have both been on this program. But this is Miriam Barghouti, who I got to play this for you. A listener sent this, and I wanted to share it. Here she is on CNN. You don't often hear this on cable or national news.
The Gaza Strip that's been under siege for 15 years. I went to the Gaza Strip in 2019 for a week, and I returned thinking that Gaza was ready to be buried. And now it's being bombed after a pandemic. So this argument of Hamas, quite frankly, at this point is disgusting.
Yeah. So how do you, I'll ask you the same question. What needs to happen now to at least bring this situation back to a bearable level for the inhabitants of the Palestinian territories? At this stage, you're in Ramallah, you're living this every day.
Yes, so we don't want to bring it back to any level. Palestinians are asking for change. We're not asking for a truce that does nothing but put a pause on what happens to us daily. We are asking for change, and that needs the bravery of journalists, of politicians, of the people to say things like this is colonialism, to say things like this is ethnic cleansing. I'm speaking out, but I'm also getting death threats from settlers on my media accounts. And yet it is my words that makes people so uncomfortable. We are literally being shot down.
But Miriam, if I could, sorry to jump in, you're not getting that really at all, because in the U.S., the President Joe Biden essentially put out a statement saying Israel has a right to defend itself. There was really no mention of Palestinians. You have pro-Palestinian demonstrations that are being outlawed in several countries. So you're not really getting that worldwide condemnation, which is what I assume you would want to hear from big world powers, right? So where does that leave the Palestinians?
I think we've been getting many condemnations and many words of deep concerns for what is happening to us. What we need is it's not Biden. It is on the Americans themselves to say we don't want to be complicit. That's what pressures governments. It's not the governments that decide. They represent the people. So the people is what we're targeting. The people is who we're appealing to. The people, the reporters, the journalists, the writers, the analysts, to start saying Palestinian. We've been erased from the narrative. They've been calling us Arabs.
All right, I thought that was interesting. Palestinian writer Miriam Barghouti. Also, I got a message from a longtime listener, Erica Francis, who said that I referred to Palestinians as Arabs. And it's interesting. That's the first I think I heard. Well, the second now, because Erica made me aware of it, of them saying that they prefer to be referred to as Palestinian. I always have known and heard it referred to as the Arab-Israeli conflict in history. So F me. I'll get it right now. Erica, you were right. It sounds like. And Miriam just taught me as well. So if anybody else wants to weigh in, I'd love to hear from you. Also, listener Joe Liotta sent this hilarious clip of stand-up comedian Sammy Obeid, who I don't know, O-B-E-I-D. I've never met him, but I thought this was great. The audio is terrible, partially because that's what Joe Liotta generally deals in. He only sends me things with mediocre to terrible audio. It's about 2 minutes. I think this is such a great bit. Hopefully you can tolerate the audio, because this is a Palestinian-American comedian performing at the Anti-Defamation League, and it's Very, very funny.
I'm 3/4 Arab, but with a beard I look 4/3 Arab. You know what I mean? Now that you guys like me, I'll go ahead and say it. I'm Palestinian American. Shoot, yeah! You booked me! I'm a very proud Palestinian, but I'm your friend. You know what I mean? I put the pal in Palestinian. What? So you're getting weirded out. That's fine. My great-grandma was born in Bethlehem. I tell people this, like, oh, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania? I'm like, yeah, that's the one, for sure, dude. She was Amish. No, it's the Bethlehem. Everybody knows that Jesus is from Bethlehem, right? But most people can't point it out on a map. It's a very complicated geopolitical question and answer. Fair enough. My niece asked me last Christmas. She's 5 years old. Where's Bethlehem? I gave her the simplest answer you could, a 5-year-old. I said, well, technically it's in Palestine. But America, we don't recognize Palestine as a country, so technically it's in the Palestinian territories, specifically the West Bank, not the Gaza Strip. It was part of Israel, but they handed over the Palestinian National Authority in 1995 under the interim agreement of Sub 25, Section 2, UN resolution. Of course, before that, part of British mandate Palestine, of course, before that, part of the Ottoman Empire. You could argue that it still is in Israel technically, of course, because Israel technically occupies the West Bank. But Israel, of course, would say that is not the truth, because that is against international law under many counts. Don't tell the UN, JK, they already know. It's really very complicated, but Jesus is from there. Merry Christmas. So that was the simplest answer I gave her. 45 seconds. I tried my best. And then she's like, well, is Santa Claus real? I'm like, 100% Santa Claus real. Are you kidding me? Like, what are you getting me for Christmas? I gave the gift of Palestine. What more do you want? Like, people pay to see my shows. I gave it to you free of charge. She's like, free Palestine? I was like, exactly. You know how hard it is to do that joke in front of this crowd? I just did it because it was your pal. I'm your pal. I love you. Let's work together to bring peace and the end of hatred all across the world.
All right, that's comedian Sammy Obeid. Thanks, Joe Liotta, but unfortunately the audio wasn't great. Maybe I shouldn't have played it. I'm having regrets. Are you still listening? Was it terrible, the audio? Because it was a very, very funny and well-performed bit. Okay, now that is all I've got for you for the last 24, and there's so much more to report and talk about and at least mention, but very little time to do it, which is why I crunch it all in to the news dump. Take it away, Pete Coe, another jingle.
Ravens at the Costco cart pecking at your stuff. They're making off with your groceries on today's news dump.
Oh, I hope it was Ricky Schroeder's Costco cart. Thank you, Pete. Let's start in New Jersey, where a New Jersey police officer has been arrested and charged with running a meth lab out of his home. The Monmouth County prosecutor announced on Facebook Monday, and Newsweek reported, Officer Christopher Walls has been a member of the Long Branch Police Department for 19 years. He was charged with producing, possessing, and selling methamphetamine. We talk a lot about cops beating up and hurting people, especially black folks. But a lot of cops are just corrupt and running side games and hustles and taking bribes, extorting from people who they're sworn to protect. So we've got to crack down on that, too, in law enforcement as we talk about law enforcement reform. Let's stay on the East Coast, though. It's New York City, where the marathon is coming back in November. That is right. The New York Roadrunners announced Monday that the 50th running of the New York City Marathon will be staged on November 7th. The modified field size of 33,000 runners was determined after consulting with state and city officials, and I'm sure that's going to be the case in cities across the country and the world as more and more people are getting vaccinated. Parler is back in Apple's App Store with conditions. Parler is an app, and it violated the Apple App Store's policies. It's a conservative-leaning platform that labeled itself a free speech alternative to Facebook and Twitter, but it was bounced from the App Store and Google Play in January, as well as dropped from Amazon's web hosting service amid accusations that posts on the platform contain hateful content, with some serving as possible incitement to violence. So we'll see what happens with the future of that trash. Speaking of trash, big pharma executives mocked people they called pillbillies and emails in the West Virginia opioid trial. It is a pretty stunning admission, or it shouldn't be at all, but executives at one of the U.S.'s largest drug distributors circulated rhymes and emails mocking hillbillies who became addicted to their poisons and painkillers, even as the company poured hundreds of millions of pills into parts of Appalachia at the heart of America's opioid epidemic.
A coalition of human rights groups is calling to boycott the Beijing Olympics. The United States is sending 20 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines abroad in June. South Carolina deputies have been fired after pepper spraying and tasing a mentally ill man in jail. And this is great news coming out of Russia, where Chernobyl is showing signs of possible new nuclear accident, according to scientists. And finally, the Pentagon is preparing to declassify a UFO report, which I think is really very exciting. And I think the UFOs are what is controlling the automation that we're living in. Who's with me? Huh? Does that make any sense to anyone? No? All right. That's fine. I hope that's not the case either. But it'll be interesting if we ever do find out. And that is your news dump, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I've got for you on the news. And now it's time to get to the real reason that you're here, why we started this podcast, which is to learn from our expert, fascinating, very interesting guests who are joining us. And I got two great guys joining me today on the program. Coming up, I've got staff writer from The Atlantic, McKay Coppins, who has a great piece in The Atlantic about Brett Kavanaugh, which is very important. And McKay has been covering Republican and conservative movement for a long time. This piece called Is Brett Kavanaugh Out for Revenge? That's coming up. But first, I want to share with you my conversation with Aaron David Miller, who is a longtime friend and guest of mine, joins me regularly here on the podcast and did on the Sirius XM show and at CNN. He's a senior fellow now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focused on U.S. foreign policy. He's written 5 books, including most recently, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Oh, boy, how prescient that was. He's had a Ph.D. in Middle East and U.S. diplomatic history, and between 1978 and 2003, served at the State Department as a historian, analyst, negotiator, and advisor to both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state. He tweets at Aaron D. Miller 2, and here we go.
First time that any of these issues have surfaced in a way that mainstream media has been interested in them. I've been on the phone for 2 solid days sitting right here giving interviews, either to CNN or, well, that's the only one I can do. I can do PBS, according to my contract.
I'm that. And I want to know more about that, because what you're saying is that there is a lot more interest in this conflict, which continues to come in so many different iterations all the time than there has been before.
Well, certainly since there have been a few times during the Trump years over the Jerusalem issue that this complex of issues has risen to the top. I can't remember, maybe there's a U.S.-Iran issue in the era of COVID, but not since COVID. Not since Trump and not since COVID has anything related to the Israeli-Palestinian issue not just risen, but is incredibly sustained in the mainstream media. I did a Clubhouse event last week. Now, I'm a newbie at Clubhouse. The guy who organizes this room, he does a lot of foreign policy. There were 2,000 people on this call. I think it was one of the most frequented rooms in Clubhouse for that week. So it suggests something. I'm not sure what, and I don't want to overanalyze it.
I have a theory.
Okay.
It is different. We could talk about COVID. We could talk about politics, talk about Trump, Biden, the new president. But to me, the thing that's different, because I've been following this issue as long as I've been in media, and it's the videos. Specifically, it's very similar to the Black Lives Matter movement, George Floyd. We saw that video, seen videos of the rockets and the Iron Dome. And more importantly, something I'm not sure, you're talking about Clubhouse. I'm not sure how familiar you are with TikTok, but if you aren't, you're going to have to be. You can't resist it. And once you get in, by the way, forget about it. You never get out. But the TikTok videos of both Israelis, Palestinians, even American military members just doing training exercises, those videos are creating a new audience. And we could talk about for better or for worse, but I feel like the videos and the way they are being shared is something that has been missing and all the previous conflicts before.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. This is, I don't want to trivialize this because people are dying, but you've seen 3 previous rounds in 08, 09, in 2012 and 2014. Now, there was social media in 2014. And remember, 2014 lasted for 50 days. 2,200 or 2,300 Palestinians were killed in Operation Protective Edge, 67 Israeli soldiers and 6 Israelis, largely because of the asymmetry of Iron Dome and the density of Gaza, which explains much about, and 1 million children, by the way, out of a population of 2 million plus, 2 million. It skews very young. So you get 200 people have been killed, over 50 kids.
But the difference between then and now, again, is just how the rapid amount of change of that media. So now I don't know the ubiquity of these videos on all sides, the ability to quickly upload and most importantly, share them. I don't think that they were being seen. They were being seen in real time. You definitely could not live stream back then. We could have seen one of these buildings go down, and right. See that video over and over if that kind of thing had happened before. But I feel like, really, I'm telling you, TikTok and the way that it is shared and the way that videos are being depends on who takes advantage. I was going to say a different sense of balance, but everybody uses it differently to different effect.
You remember in the earlier weeks, a couple weeks ago, the TikTok videos of Palestinians slapping Orthodox Jews on the light rail. It wasn't just, it led to a reaction on the part of the Israeli right and the extreme right. And it became a central focus of stirring the pot in a major way.
And similarly to that, not quite in terms of the visceral quality of that video, though, was, and you write about this in your, I think, most recent CNN piece, was the fact that Israelis went into a mosque and dropped flashbang grenades on a holy high holiday, in the entire Arab world sees that and reacts to it, and that is something we maybe haven't seen.
No, I think you probably. Plus let's be clear, the Biden presidency, as humane and sane as it is, just doesn't generate the kind of wall-to-wall coverage. The fact that Trump is not tweeting is another reason. It was 24/7 exposure, and now there's plenty to write about. But I think that also may explain this event. But you're right. I think the pictures, the violence, the sense of despair, all of it has created in some respects toxic, but in other respects a kind of
transparency.
It's like, I made a comment on CNN this morning with Kate Baldwin. I said, Biden deprioritized the Middle East, and there are legitimate reasons to do that. It's just not as important as it used to be. It doesn't mean it's not important, but it was like the Hotel California. It came back to slap him in the face, and you can check out any time, but you can't leave. And the administration is trying to figure out how to navigate this. I think much to the dismay of progressive Democrats, and a variety of other humans who kind of don't understand. This is not Trump. Biden is not Trump. He waited 3 or 4 weeks to call Netanyahu. He's had his own negative experiences with Netanyahu. And yet, I have a theory about what's going on, and I hope I'm correct. But it may well be that a man faced with the greatest challenge of national recovery since Roosevelt, with none of Roosevelt's majorities in the House or Senate, is simply not going to want to get involved in an issue which, frankly, you and I have been around the block on this one. Whether it lasts another week or ends tomorrow, the opportunities for using this crisis to make anything good happen are slim to none.
Yeah, it's a great point in terms of what he wants to get done domestically, what he has to get done domestically with such slim margins in that and right now he's getting a lot of criticism from his progressive flank, from AOC to Senator Bernie Sanders, who both, they've both, that side has gained a lot of influence and being critical of Biden. You tweeted, Biden's seeming lack of urgency and indifference in pressing for an Israeli-Hamas stand down is troubling. Longer this goes on, greater danger of mass casualty event on either side that could spur even more death and destruction. And there's so many different angles to look at this, but let's just stay on this one more time, just domestically from an American point of view, from the Biden administration's point of view. What should they do?
Well, if you look at the last three...
And also just a little history on that relationship. I mean, Netanyahu, there can be very little love lost between Netanyahu and Joe Biden, who was the vice president for Obama when Netanyahu came over here and spoke as an invitation to Republicans and then did everything he could. And in fact, in the end, sank the Iran agreement. So there's a lot there.
Well, I think between Trump and Netanyahu, they are killing the bipartisanship that has made a balanced U.S.-Israeli relationship sustainable. Trump turned this into an exclusive relationship. He was more interested, frankly, in courting conservative Republicans and evangelicals than he was the American Jewish community. And Netanyahu absolutely cares more about evangelicals, who, despite the generational differences, are probably more united on the issue of Israel than the Jewish community of 7.5 million people, half of whom aren't even affiliated with any Jewish organization or a synagogue. And I think
the Jewish American community, 7 million.
Yeah, the American Jewish community, correct. So, I mean, look, Charlie Cook did an analysis of incumbents' parties during the first midterms since 1946. The average loss for a first-term president's party in the first midterms, average loss is 22 in the House and 3 in the Senate, which means essentially, if anything like that happens, Biden's domestic agenda is over.
And so they have to look at the congressmen and women who are in districts where this could be an animating issue. And also, guess who else is looking at that? I'm guessing. I'm guessing he reads Charlie Cook too. Benjamin Netanyahu. He must pay very close attention because they get so much money from us, and they don't want to lose that money and support.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure. Even though there are generational changes and the confluence of values and interests that seem to bind the U.S.-Israeli relationship over the years are under great stress. Huge stress. There's probably more that divides the United States and Israel right now, given the Netanyahu government on Iran and on the Palestinian issue, certainly than any time in recent years.
How much do you?
The value affinity is the other thing. I mean, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, despite the importance of domestic politics and the presence of a relatively small but affluent and very influential Jewish community, rests on value affinity. Once the image of Israel changes in the mind of America, the U.S.-Israeli relationship will change. Now, you see the beginnings of that on the part of young Democrats, and the popular polling suggests it as well. It's interesting to speculate, well, what would happen if Benjamin Netanyahu simply was no longer the prime minister? Would there be any kind of course correction? And that's where the recent crisis is. I mean, Netanyahu did Hamas such an extraordinary favor during Ramadan by pursuing a careless and provocative policy in Jerusalem. And Hamas's rockets, and it's not even Christmas yet, Hamas's rockets returned the favor in kind by essentially giving Netanyahu, once the rockets started to fly, the David and Goliath image of the first 3 weeks of this conflict, where the perception was large numbers of Israeli police beating up on Palestinians or the scene in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, all that shifted now. And it's sunk the Change Coalition. My understanding was they were very close to reaching an agreement to form another government. That's all gone now. Add to that the communal violence between Jewish and Arab Israelis in a half a dozen cities and towns. And, you got a multi-front crisis, which is playing to the right and to Netanyahu.
Yeah, that's something that seems to be a huge change or difference, the communal violence, and really scary and very important. What we've seen these videos of these buildings going down, but most recently, the one building that housed a lot of media, including the Associated Press and others. And that just looks very bad for Israelis' image as well. Of course, they say Hamas had intel in there. They probably did. Who knows? But the bottom line is...
But let's assume they did. All right, and let's assume, according to the laws of war, if they don't cause civilian casualties and they warn and it's proportionate. Let's assume all that's right.
Okay.
Assume also that Hamas's military intelligence organization had an office in that building. And by the way, Blinken today, I think, said that he hasn't seen the evidence.
Oh, wow.
Let's assume all of that. The fact that the Israelis may have the right to do it according to laws of war doesn't make it right. And it's not smart. Jim Baker, never go to war with the media. What if the warnings have been delayed? What if a number of people had not evacuated that building?
It looks terrible. It was the highest vantage point. That's why they were there, so they could see everything. And then they're taking away eyes and ears in a time where, as we were talking about, video matters so much, is another way of looking at it.
Right.
So, by the way, I heard on yesterday, I think it was, Face the Nation, our friend John Dickerson, you had Benjamin Netanyahu, and Dickerson rightly asked him, where is the intelligence? Did you give the intelligence? You talked to Joe Biden today, the President Biden today. Did you tell him about the intelligence? And Netanyahu kind of mumbled under his breath, our security services gave it to their security services. Bottom line is, I'm no journalist, but I would just ask, based on what you just said about Blinken, if the Secretary of State hasn't seen it, the President hasn't seen it, I would just love to know where that information is. But we can talk about that another time, and follow up on it. But let's talk about just quickly the Palestinians. I think the most important thing, one of so many important things to know, but is that they are divided. You have to start with the fact that the Palestinians themselves are divided into two separate factions: the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority. How important? I mean, you're negotiating with so many different people, including a divided Palestinian people, right?
Well, yeah, the Palestinian National Movement, since Hamas seized control in 2007 in Gaza, looks like Noah's Ark. There are two of everything. There are two constitutions, there are two sets of security services, there are two statelets. There are actually two visions of what Palestine is supposed to be and even where it's supposed to be. And unless you have one gun, one authority, one negotiating position, the Israelis have a ready-made justification not to deal with this seriously. And others have made this argument, and I don't think it's a stretch, that Mr. Netanyahu is much more comfortable with what I call the three-state solution rather than the two-state solution. You have the Palestinians controlling 40% of the West Bank. That's Mahmoud Abbas, and the Palestinian Authority. You have Hamas in Gaza, and you have Israel. And as long as that situation prevails, the Israelis are not under great pressure, because they're simply going to say, look, we're not even considering territorial concession unless you can assure me that all of the guns of Palestine will fall silent. And the fact is, I got no brief for Hamas here. Hamas hijacked what could have been last Monday, when 150 rockets were launched, 7 toward Jerusalem. The Israelis believed that Hamas had changed the rules of the game. They hijacked a movement which had a David and Goliath sort of appeal.
Yeah.
The Israelis were Goliath and the Palestinians were David. And once the rockets start, and by the way, the intensity of the barrages, you had 1 million Israelis sleeping in shelters, which they have and the Palestinians don't, and they have Iron Dome, but you have large parts of the Israeli public never before affected by Hamas's rockets. So Hamas has accomplished, much to the detriment of Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, a great deal. They're the defender of Aqsa. They've sunk any hopes of a negotiating coalition. And they're making the Palestinian Authority out to be feckless and weak as they defend Palestine and Jerusalem. It's astounding to me.
Well, you write about this in great detail in your piece at Foreign Affairs. Israel and Hamas need each other, and a new round of conflict won't change that. You wrote that back in late March, but it is extremely relevant and highly informative to the reader to try to understand the dynamics there, because they are so important. There's so much politics, and there's so much kind of history, but also, you know, a game in terms of the long range and what you want to get out of this in the future. And I just wonder what you think about Netanyahu being accused of, by pretty much everybody, basically, of, you know, playing domestic politics, using this conflict to win domestic politics, which it seems he now has gained control of his government for like the 90th time. He's under all kinds of indictments and corruption scandals, and he was about to lose control of the government. Then this conflict happens, and somehow he has gained control. I think somebody conceded somewhere that gave him the numbers he needed. Is that right?
No, he hasn't. He's still a caretaker prime minister. No, he still doesn't have 60 plus to form a narrowly based right-wing government. But what he does have is a chance to contest yet another election, the 5th, in probably 3 or 4 months. So he's lived to fight again. I don't know how this is going to play out ultimately. I really don't. He bears some responsibility for sure for Hamas's success in creating new leverage and some new deterrence, which is one of the reasons I think, by the way, I don't think Netanyahu is dictating the Israeli Defense Forces strategy on this. I think they seem determined to accomplish more in Gaza, and they claim there's more left to do. Rocket production facilities, killing Hamas leaders and commanders. But I'm telling you, the longer it goes on, the greater the danger. Someone tweeted this out the other day. You read it, and someone said, we already have a mass casualty event. Well, I take the point. The asymmetry of casualties is stunning. In the last decade, Pete, 18 Israelis have been killed total in the confrontations with Hamas during these cross-border wars. 18. Now, and that's because of Iron Dome. It's because of shelters. It's because of the density of the population of Gaza. And I don't care if the Israelis go out of their way to avoid civilian casualties. It's inevitable if you're operating in those circumstances, and if Hamas, which they are co-locating their own military assets in densely populated areas. That's what's going to happen. But when I'm talking about a mass casualty event, like we saw in Operation Grapes of Wrath in 1996 between Israel and Hezbollah, when an errant Israeli artillery shell hit a UN compound and 100 people were killed.
Yeah.
100.
Well, you mentioned Hezbollah. That is the other really important concern, is that Israel is obviously always has to have their head on a swivel, and we can talk about the Arab world and how they have used the Palestinians, how seemingly everybody has the conflict there. But, you know, what is Hezbollah thinking right now, and Lebanon? How are they looking at this? And what is Israel thinking about what they're thinking?
There were a number of rockets and demonstrations on the border. But I think we haven't talked about the impact of this on the Iran nuclear negotiations.
Sure. Oh, yeah, great point. Yeah.
Vienna. And, I often wonder if they were close to a deal, which I don't think they are, would Iran be reluctant to sign that deal when, in fact, you have the image of Israelis bombing Gaza? And who is Hamas's prime supplier? They're making most of these rockets themselves in local production facilities, but the component parts which are smuggled in, there's a lot of Iranian involvement. And I can see it. Anyone who does not like this Iranian nuclear agreement is just waiting for evidence that Iran is somehow helping Hamas kill Israelis, which is the other piece of this. But I suspect if they agree in Vienna on removal of sanctions and Iranian compliance in a way to allow each side to re-enter the agreement without appearing weak, whether or not sanctions relief is really important to Iran. The real constraint, I think, is the presidential elections coming up in June. Closer you get to those, the harder it's going to be to sign a deal.
In Israel?
No.
Oh, in Iran, the Iranian presidential election.
The nuclear deal.
But
so far, there seems to be a compartmentalization of what's happening in Gaza and in Vienna, where the negotiations are taking place.
So important. So much more to talk about. So much history here. I love reading everything, even your tweeting, much less your articles. Always great to get to fire a few questions at you, sir. So thank you so much for joining me and enlightening me with your amazing credibility and experience on this issue, which is always tough.
And I really hope this ends. And I hope we don't. I love talking to you, but I hope we don't have to do another interview in a week or 10 days. There's been some ghastly event.
Yeah, well, I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I fear we're going to have to keep talking about it. I appreciate you joining me too, though, because I always learn out. Thank you, sir.
Likewise, Pete.
Cut him off there. Aaron David Miller at Aaron D. Miller 2. Check him out at the Carnegie Endowment. Read him at CNN, where he's also a contributor. Definitely thank him for joining me. I always learn a lot when I speak with him. We'll get several points of view on that issue because, like I said, sadly, I don't think that's going away anytime soon. And if I've said anything incorrect or wrong or offensive, this is always a sensitive issue on this or anything, by the way. You can't upset me with your criticism, so please send it. It's helpful. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Okay, now it's time to get to my second guest of today's show. He is a writer at The Atlantic, which is one of my two favorite magazines. My two favorite magazines are The Week and The Atlantic. I like both these. Of course, I like several others as well, but McKay Coppins is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of The Wilderness, a book about the battle over the future of the Republican Party, and his most recent piece is what we discussed in our conversation today. It's the first time he's joined me on the podcast, but he joined me regularly throughout the years at SiriusXM. This piece is titled, Is Brett Kavanaugh Out for Revenge? 3 years after his polarizing confirmation hearings, the Supreme Court's 114th justice remains a mystery. It's in the June 2021 issue. McKay is on Twitter, by the way, at McKay Coppins, and here is our conversation for you right now. Joining me now from his amazing-looking office somewhere, McKay Coppins, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, and thank you for the compliment on my bookshelves. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you got you got a really nice bookshelf behind you. And how has it been for you? I like asking people that. You've mostly been working from home. You've got little kids. How are you handling it all?
Yeah, it hasn't been, it's been fine. I think other people have been worse, but yeah, I've been working from home full time. I've got 3 little kids, and our schools didn't reopen until just recently. And they're still only kind of partly reopened. So it's been an adventure. How are you doing?
I'm good. I feel like the bar is really low. Like the question is, do you still love your spouse and your children?
Yes, we all still love each other. We have driven each other insane, but yes, we're still plugging along here.
Well, the answer to my answer has been I've loved it. Outside of the like 1 million people that died horrific deaths in America alone, it's been good for me, like for a lot of reasons. So I look amazing in a mask. My eyes and eyebrows. You know, as a bald man, you like a mask and a hat, right?
So you had already come to the pandemic aesthetic of the shaved head and the beard. This is a new look for me, and I'm still figuring it out.
Well, it looks how you sound or what your resume looks like. You look smart. You look like a smart
I'll take it.
professor or academic or journalist, which is what you are. And this is a really interesting article. Let's get into it because it's super important now.
your beat. Describe your beat to people who maybe haven't listened, but mostly politics, especially conservative and Republican politics, right?
Yeah, I've been covering primarily the right in America for like the past decade now. Presidential campaigns, the White House, Congress. This element of my beat was kind of new because the Supreme Court for me had always been kind of part of my political coverage, right? It's always looming over everything that I write about, but writing about the inner workings of the Supreme Court was new for me. But I think a Brett Kavanaugh profile was the right vehicle into the story.
So when you go to profile a Supreme Court justice, it looks like you must have talked to like 20, 40 people. I mean, how do you go about, who did you talk to for it?
Yeah, it's weird because, you know, with very, very rare exceptions, Supreme Court justices don't give interviews. Like they just don't play ball with stuff like this. So you know that it's going to be a write around where you're talking to people in their lives. I always, with doing profiles, I like to start from kind of the outer ring and then work my way in. So I started with kind of like reporters who had covered the Supreme Court or Brett Kavanaugh for a long time, kind of picked their brains. Then I moved a little closer with, people who had gone to college with him, people who had known him at various points in his life. And then eventually I arrived at his former law clerks. And that's like a whole universe of people who have been in his offices, in his chambers while he's making big decisions and have worked really long hours with him and gotten to see him in various contexts and know him really well. And those were the people who I was most kind of eager to talk to because I knew they would know a lot, but I also knew they'd be hard to crack because they're like fiercely loyal usually to the judge they've worked for. And so I had to it took a lot of time. And then you also talk to other clerks for other justices or judges who have who've been in those chambers, and also friends and people in his neighborhood in Chevy Chase. It was basically, I think, I don't know the final number, but it was definitely in the dozens in terms of people I called or talked to.
Also, his church, which I want to get to, is a really interesting thing that you learned about how all the drama played out, or the aftermath of the confirmation hearings with Brett Kavanaugh, and how that played out at his parish. But you also mentioned this. Is it Code of Omerta? I just lost my notes. So you touched on that, but people don't generally talk, and in a way that's kind of respectable, but at the same time, I mean, just as a process question, you're from the Atlantic. You're writing a profile on Brett Kavanaugh with or without their input. They're probably going to want to say something. It's most likely going to be positive if they're going to say it. But how do you get those people to not break that code but say anything at all? Well,
there were kind of two categories of clerks who talked to me. So there was like one in terms of people who were close to Kavanaugh, right? So there's this whole other universe of clerks who clerked for other judges or justices who maybe didn't feel the same loyalty to Kavanaugh, and they would say, I'm not going to talk about what my boss or my former boss said, but I'll give you some observations about Kavanaugh. Then within the world of Kavanaugh clerks, there were these two categories. And one was the people that Kavanaugh or who had, I don't want to make too obvious a presumption here, but people who essentially were dispatched to give me the party line on Kavanaugh, right? Kavanaugh knew I was working on this piece. As I write in the story, he is hyper attentive to his press coverage. He cares a lot about what outlets like The Atlantic write about him. And so there were clerks who I could tell were kind of giving me what the version of the story Kavanaugh wanted to be told. And I actually thought that was helpful. It's useful to know what he wants to be told, but that's not the only story, right? That's not the only side of the story. So then there was this other category of clerks who I basically begged and pleaded and bothered long enough that they agreed to talk to me on background, meaning that I couldn't use their names and that they would that as long as I kind of protected their anonymity enough, they would kind of give me some of their more off-message observations about Kavanaugh.
I love the Atlantic magazine. I've always loved your work, but it's important. I just want to make such a big deal of how much, everybody is writing articles now. Everybody's just writing, blogs and putting them out there, and they're just not all equal. You write long form, you write at the Atlantic, and you take a long time to research and put this all together. You've got editors. It's a big deal. Everybody should read it and share it, which is why I'm really happy to talk to you. And also, when you're talking there, you said Brett Kavanaugh is hyper aware of his media coverage, and it just made me think for just a moment, just maybe, since you're joining me. Hey, Brett, Justice Kavanaugh, thanks for tuning in to Stand Up with Pete Dominick. Tell your friends. And by your friends, I mean everybody that McKay is writing about in this article, who you tried to connect with, because it's an important and fascinating piece about Brett Kavanaugh. But it's 3 years now, since he was confirmed to the court?
Yeah, and that was part of the reason that we wanted to do the piece. I don't know about you, but I feel like the confirmation battle over Brett Kavanaugh was one of the most intense periods of the last 5 years in American politics.
I would say it was so intense that probably the most intense thing that ever happened to me in my career happened during then, and I can say it because it's all public. But my colleague came to me and said, I can't handle the callers calling about Brett Kavanaugh because so many of them are saying, blaming Christine Blasey Ford, that she's lying, and the whole Me Too movement had spiked. But this young woman who was working for me then came out and talked about her own sexual assault and told me early on first. And so it was everybody around the world, certainly in media covering politics, that were dealing with this more acutely. It was specifically the most intense time for me for my career. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to give you that example of, yes, you are right about that for sure.
See, and I think that people were having experiences like that all over the country, right? This is the thing that made the Kavanaugh confirmation battle such a big deal. It was both important because any Supreme Court justice has a lot of power, and he was going to occupy a basically swing seat on the court. So it was especially important. It was happening during the Trump era. But also, I think that what happened is everybody projected their own experiences onto this story, right? Whether it was, like you said, your colleague who had experienced sexual assault or other traumatic experiences, lots of people are bringing that into the conversation. Yep. People, we read stories about people who felt like they looked at Brett Kavanaugh and saw their own sons and were worried that their sons would be unduly, accused of something in the future. Men, women, everybody was projecting their own experiences, their own worldviews onto this. And what I thought was so interesting is that by the end of the confirmation, Kavanaugh himself had almost blurred into an abstraction. It wasn't really about Brett Kavanaugh, the jurist, the judge, the justice. It was about all these other conversations we were having in the wake of the Me Too movement about predation and privilege and sexual assault. And those are really important conversations. But Kavanaugh's now on the bench. And so the decision that my editors and I kind of made was that he has this lifetime appointment no matter what you thought of all the way he got there. And I think it's really important to assess what kind of justice he's going to be, because a lot of things hang in the balance. A lot of big, important issues hang in the balance. And the kind of contentious path he took to the court could influence the kind of justice he is. We have precedent for judges going through dramatic confirmation battles and that kind of altering their trajectory, most notably Clarence Thomas. And so I wanted to see how that experience about 3 years after he had been nominated might have changed his trajectory and what it means for the country.
I like the title of the article, and I think it's a really important question as well, because the most fair criticism of Brett Kavanaugh during that hearing was his reaction to the Democrats on the panel that were asking him questions, and it became so partisan in a moment of the almost like the few good men of, yes, you're damn right, I ordered the code red, when he started screaming at Democrats. And it wasn't hard for anybody, much less an expert Supreme Court watcher, to say this guy is so mad and has said some things that maybe he shouldn't be on the court because he's been so biased and partisan here. But more importantly, the question you're trying to answer is he going to now decide on Supreme Court cases based on how he was treated by Democrats or liberals in the media or in general, or even in his own community, as I think you dig into? That's why this is such an important question to answer, I think. And how do we answer it?
Yeah. So basically what I heard from people who were closest to Kavanaugh is that he had these two competing impulses once he had gone through the confirmation process. On the one side, he is, I'm told, still incredibly angry about his treatment in the confirmation. Somebody said, one friend said that he was extremely mad at Democrats, full stop, for what they had done to him. Another said that, he's made a show of kind of saying, I'm not bitter, I'm going to move past this. But when he's laying in bed at night, it's hard not to think about this. Even in his neighborhood in Chevy Chase, he lives in one of these kind of affluent liberal neighborhoods in the suburbs of D.C. I spent some time there on a very nice spring afternoon where, it's $1 million houses with no justice, no peace signs in front of them. And in that world, Brett Kavanaugh had been a kind of beloved neighbor. He was the carpool dad. He coached the girls' basketball team. And after the confirmation process, a lot of people turned on him. And, he became this kind of lightning rod. And so in some ways, he is still seething over his treatment. On the other hand, I'm told by his friends, he also has this kind of burning desire to get back into the good graces of the kind of centrist or center left establishment. Like, he wants to be able to speak at Harvard Law School and go to the functions that Supreme Court justices are invited to, and kind of live his life without fear of being like hectored in public by activists. And so the question that I heard most often from people in his kind of circle was, if he's going to be pulled in one direction or another, I don't know the answer. It's either he's going to be pulled in the direction of wanting revenge, or he's going to be pulled in the direction of kind of bending over backwards to re-ingratiate himself with liberals. And, obviously the best case scenario is that he would be able to set aside the whole experience and just look at the cases based on his own judicial philosophy. And I think that, certainly he'll do some of that, and he has done some of that. But my biggest takeaway from reporting this piece was that these justices on the Supreme Court are much more human than we realize. Like, they are much more governed by things like politics and ego and grievance and status anxiety than they want to let on. They have this image of being these kind of wise figures who are ruling from on high and dispensing their wisdom. And they are, in a lot of cases, impressive people, but they are also people. They're also, like anybody else, there is internal politics in the Supreme Court. And so those kind of extracurricular things do matter.
Yeah. And you write about some other justices, the liberals in particular, reaching out to him. And I want to ask you about that if we have time. But yeah, I'm going to radicalize you by suggesting the work of Professor Eric Siegel, who's a longtime friend of mine, who wrote 2 books, Supreme Myths About How the Court is Not a Court, The Justices Are Not Justices. And I'd love to hear your take on his work. Let me, now, given this article and all the work that you did for it. So talk to me about, even wealthy, affluent, justices like Brett Kavanaugh, they usually have safe spaces because they live behind a cage in a moat, but they need safe spaces. Your church would be one of those spaces. Mm-hmm. What happens at Brett Kavanaugh's Catholic Church kind of before and after? Who is he before and who is he after the confirmation hearings?
Yeah, so the Shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament is the name of the parish that he goes to in Chevy Chase. It's kind of known in the D.C. area as a parish that is frequented by elite Catholics across the partisan spectrum. So you have people like Chris Matthews, the hardball host, who goes there, and Brett Kavanaugh, and Republicans, Democrats. And it's known as a place where you go to church and set aside your political differences. Everybody tries to just not talk about politics. It's a very bipartisan place. And for the most part, they've been able to kind of keep the peace over the years. Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation was a rare case where politics kind of seeped into the parish and divided the parish. And, I talked to Father Foley, who's the priest there, who said that he was swamped with emails and letters, arguing one way or the other about whether Kavanaugh should be confirmed. There were conversations about whether Kavanaugh should even be able to receive communion. There were people grumbling about, various aspects of his kind of alleged youthful sins and parsing the details of them. And there were some people who identified with Kavanaugh, especially I think the kind of more affluent ones who sent their kids to schools like Georgetown Prep, the prep school that Kavanaugh went to, who just tended to be more defensive of him. And then there were others who were, kind of irate that anybody would kind of rally to his defense. And so it really became a subject of controversy within the parish and was uncomfortable for a lot of people because, like I said, this was not the norm for this parish. This parish is used to having controversial political stories happening outside of the church, but inside the church, it's kind of a safe haven. And that was not the case during the Kavanaugh confirmation battle and in the aftermath.
I'm going to do a tease to try to get clicks for this article specifically from people listening to this, which is after the confirmation hearings, he goes to church, and after church, he goes outside and, well, you'll have to read the article.
Yeah,
that's a good one. It's a good tease. That'll create clips. That's one of my favorite anecdotes that you learn from it.
Strange thing. I'll on top of the tease say very strange scene outside of the church, and this is in the first section, so you'll get to it pretty quickly.
Oh, and by the way, here's another way to tease. I didn't know that yours was the first Atlantic article that I discovered, and I'm a subscriber. The functionality of listening to an article. You can listen to this article, folks. And here's the topper. It's not that McKay doesn't have a great voice, but whoever they hired to read this article has the warmest voice. This man who, I don't know if you know who he is, but I bet you hope that people think that that's you.
That guy is great. Let me tell you something about that guy just really quickly. This is probably like not good radio.
No,
but
it is.
The company that does that is called Autumn. A big fan of theirs. Yeah. They and they actually do stories for a lot of different long form magazines and stuff. And they actually asked me after they had done a couple of my stories. Somebody there reached out to me and said, do you have a guy that you prefer? Because you've had a couple different people narrate your stories. And I was like, this guy sounds, he's distinguished but still warm. And absolutely, I hope that people think that that's me.
Yes.
I just want to sit with him and like discuss philosophy and world affairs with him.
It may be too much work for me, but I may grab the audio of him and then compare it to you and be like, folks, I'm so sorry about if you thought that was McKay. All right, so I only got do I have even 3 more minutes with you? Because I got to ask you about the Republican Party. You have to read this article about Brett Kavanaugh. I have so many more questions, but I am talking to McKay Coppins, and you are the author of The Wilderness, Deep Inside the Republican Party's Combative, Contentious CAG to Take Back the White House. This was published in December of 2015, so before Trump's election. And you know everybody. You know all of the players in the Republican Party, the conservative movement. You interviewed hundreds of them, over 300 for this book. And so I just have to ask you, given the Trump administration, given his 4 years, given the insurrection, given what most recently has happened with Liz Cheney, to me, and I hope you'll push back, but all that's left, it's a brain drain from the Republican Party, and all that's left, conspiracy theorists, white nationalists, grifters, opportunists, and a few others who are serious and want to get things done, but very few, especially in, both the House and the Senate, but we can also talk about other, media. So what is the Republican Party today in Congress, the elected Republican Party?
It's a lot of opportunists. I mean, in Congress, the members of the House and Senate, there are some of the members of the former categories that you named, the white nationalists and the, grifters and all of that. But it's a lot of members of Congress who I think in another time would be fairly conventional Republicans, but that have decided to hitch their wagon to the MAGA train, right? They see that this is where the party is, and they've been willing to kind of get rid of whatever, principles they had and follow where the voters are. But I guess to the extent that I would push back, I'd say this. And actually, let me just say quickly, having spent 10 years writing about the Republican Party, I actually find I'm having a hard time right now writing about the Republican Party. I haven't talked about this publicly that much yet, but I think it's because there's not a lot of tension in the party right now. Like any good story demands tension, right? There have to be opposing forces. And when I wrote that book you mentioned, what I was always interested in were people like Rand Paul and Paul Ryan and Marco Rubio, who are being pulled in one direction by the kind of fringe of their party, and then in the other direction by their own kind of principles or worldview or whatever. And I feel like the story of the Trump era has been that the most of these Republicans have given up any tension, right? They've almost all decided to just kind of follow Donald Trump and his movement. And there aren't as many kind of tensions to write about. But to the extent that I'd push back, I guess I would say this. The party politics is cyclical. Parties are cyclical. If you go back like 10 years or even 5 years, read my book, and you see where the party was at that point, it's fairly different than what it looks like now. I think if we could fast forward 5 or 10 years now, my hope is there's a possibility at least that we'll get there and we'll go back and read the kind of death certificates being written by pundits of the Republican Party and say, oh, that was kind of that was too much. That was too soon. Like, I don't know. I'm not going to make predictions, but there is a possibility that some kind of backlash percolates and pulls the party back. Well, I don't know. It's hard to see how, but it's possible.
The word I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, probably the most accurate and most disconcerting is anti-democratic or authoritarian, and that's where I feel like we get hung up with your criticism or analysis right there, because that's the most important thing. It's one thing to talk about how one party or another wins elections, how they raise money, how they cheat, gerrymander, the census. We can talk about all those things, but the bottom line is if the outcome of election is denied, if they don't agree that they lost, and if they create all kinds of things and losses, what is that party? What is that movement?
And that is the thing that I'm most worried about. Others have made this observation. I think it's accurate. The party over the last 5 years has actually moderated on policy and radicalized on democracy issues. So on policy, they've actually become more open to big government spending, quote unquote. They don't care as much about, they're not deficit hawks. They're not as rigid in their kind of purity tests on fiscal conservative issues or whatever. But on core questions of democracy, core questions of how, the Constitution should be administered, how elections are run, the kinds of checks and balances on executive power, the party is being radicalized in an anti-democratic direction. And I don't think I don't have a clear sense of how you reverse that trend. But obviously, I hope that it happens.
They certainly have, I think that's a good way of putting it. They certainly have moderated on policy and allowing for government to do certain things they didn't, or they pushed back against forever. But they haven't moderated on paying for it. Like they're fine. They're easier to spend money, certainly during Trump. But they haven't. The only way to pay for it apparently is to get another country, the Mexicans, to do it, because we still won't raise taxes at all to pay for any of the things that they've moderated on.
That's true. It's funny. You talk to people like Mitt Romney, who's one of the last like rational Republicans, and he feels like he's a voice in the wilderness, being like, "Hey guys, remember when we used to care about deficits and how to pay for things? Like that used to be a core Republican tenet, and at least in theory, and now nobody cares at all." So anyway.
You know me enough to know I don't have a tremendous amount of sympathy for even Mitt Romney, but I did when he was getting booed the other day, and he said, somebody was booing him. Aren't you embarrassed? And I was like, wow, he's so disconnected that he didn't maybe even know they would boo him. And no, of course they're not embarrassed. That's the whole thing they're not embarrassed. This is who we are. They are now, at least. I don't know.
Well, when you talk about Republicans who are trying to kind of still save the party, I think he's one of them, right? He's trying to drag it away from the kind of clutches that it's no doubt. I just think
you're absolutely no. I agree. He is, and so is Liz Cheney, and so are others. But my criticism is that they don't realize how far gone it is. It's not the party of Bush and McCain and Reagan, even.
right? It's the party of Trump and conspiracy theorists and all the other names that I called them. I just feel like some guys, like, they just don't quite realize it with their own. I mean, does Liz Cheney, last question, Liz Cheney get primaried in Wyoming?
Oh, yeah, I would assume so. Yes. I don't know if she loses, but I mean, she's going to have to beat back some primary challengers.
Yeah. I mean, I know one of the people that they're looking at nominating is an elk that carries an AR-15. And she has a good shot.
Donald Trump is going to endorse the elk.
The elk. Liz Cheney's terrible. This elk, however, is... I think I nailed it. I think there's elk in Wyoming.
That was a great...
I was trying to think of an animal. I was like, shit, I was almost at a joke. And I was like, I think elk?
I feel like you're going to get some angry calls about this. Like,
I hope so.
The Wyoming listeners, are there elk in Wyoming? I actually don't know.
I have several. And I'm going to forward the correspondence to you. McKay, thank you so much for joining me. Great article. Keep up the good work at The Atlantic. Everybody's got to read it for the reasons that we said. And are you doing anything? Are you working on a book? Is there any secrets that you can share? And what's next? Anything else?
Stand by. I'll have announcements for you at some point.
Very excited. Thanks for joining me, buddy. Really appreciate it. Great catching up.
Thanks. You too.
Well, you know what that music means, ladies and gentlemen. Sadly, that means today's episode 354 of Stand Up Pete Dominic is over. It's done. That is it. I am going to say goodbye to you. I am going to tell you all the things I always like to say here at the end of the program, which is please sign up for a paid subscription. I need your support because the podcast is free. You can get it anywhere. And go to Apple Podcasts in particular and write a review if you haven't already. I greatly appreciate that. Super important. Tell your friends. Subscribe on youtube.com/standupwithpete. I don't plug that, but I probably should. I don't post enough there, but I will. And take care of yourself, everybody. Be good to others. And I hope to see you Thursday night. Why did I say tonight? Tuesday. Thursday night at the Stand Up Happy Hour Hangout. Always a lot of fun. Who should we invite? Give me a heads up right now. All right, that's it. John Carroll, singer-songwriter, Grammy Award winner, and supporter and lover of this program. Johnny, take us away, buddy.
We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well, and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.